Grace Larkin. I'm a senior in Gallatin studying journalism and literature of human rights. And this summer I worked with English Penn, which is the London branch of the literature and human rights organization Penn International. And so one of the main things I worked on this summer was the Writers at Risk program. The Writers at Risk program campaigns on behalf of writers around the world who are unjustly persecuted, harassed, or imprisoned for their writing. And with this program, I worked closely with groups like Amnesty International, Index on Censorship, and Reporters Without Borders. Most of the pictures you will see are pictures of vigils and protests that were part of the Writers at Risk program. I think the best way to explain why the work is so important has to do with my experiences with the writers themselves, some of whom I was fortunate enough to meet. And so one of these was Muharrem Erbil, a prominent human rights lawyer in Turkey, as well as a published writer, editor, and columnist. I met him in one of my first weeks at Penn and felt incredibly privileged to be able to sit in on meetings with him. Turkey was the country of focus at English Penn this summer. It is now the biggest jailer of journalists, and over 100 independent newspapers and broadcasters have been shut down since the attempted failed coup in 2016. The crackdown on dissent in Turkey has seen about 50,000 people arrested and more than 140,000 people suspended or dismissed from their jobs. Muharrem had previously spent 3.5 years in pre-trial detention, and he was in London for a few days, but then was sentenced and charged again with over 6 years in prison. Based on the lack of evidence linking him to terrorism or the plotting of any kind of violence, Penn and other freedom of expression groups believe he's only been targeted because of the journalists he's defended and his peaceful human rights work. The persecution of these writers and academics and activists in Turkey has become more alarming and became more alarming every day while I was working at Penn. I remember the shock of the office when the director and chairman both of Amnesty International's Turkey office were detained, along with many other activists. Muharrem told us that any enlightened person, so politicians, writers, academics, are charged as a terrorist if he or she says anything against the current government or encourages free speech and expression. He says people can't breathe in Turkey. However, it was incredible to see how steadfast he remained in his commitment to freedom of speech. He said he doesn't have the luxury to be scared about going back to Turkey because he has a responsibility for his children and his country. And he made it clear that he will not stop his work in the way that some journalists in Turkey have chosen to stop in order to protect themselves. He says it is his right to speak freely and emphasized that it is a human responsibility to speak up for the wrongdoings of others. While referring to many friends and colleagues of his that are detained, he said, "They are more than names, they are our friends, they are more than numbers, they are people." And despite the future he faces, he remained incredibly hopeful. He said regarding going back to prison that solitude is man's first step to freedom, and he was hugely grateful for Penn's ongoing support. And when you asked him what was the most important role of an organization like Penn to people that are in prison, he said that letters and postcards are actually the most important. He acknowledged that the work that Penn does on the level of international awareness and legal campaigns is important, but he couldn't overstate the value of personal communication with individuals. He said it's important for prisoners to know their names are still being heard, and letters help show solidarity to fight individual despair and hopelessness. He said hopelessness is the hardest part about being in prison. And this is something that I learned while working with Penn, is the importance of talking to the individuals and maintaining a human connection with these people that we're all working for. I had to unlearn the idea that the most helpful change, at least for my fellowship, would come from the level of legal and political reform. When talking to Muharrem and others, it became clear that the human rights work I was doing, the most important thing was on the individual and personal level. It was talking to prisoners and their families, and communicating with them human to let them know that their work would not be forgotten. He also said that although the situation is bleak, one must believe that change can occur, and this is crucial for any writer or activist. He was insistent that change has happened and continues to happen all over the world, if not in Turkey at the moment. It was a very humbling experience. And one of the parts of the summer that impacted me most was the death of Lou Xiaobo. English Penn had worked closely on his case, and Kat Lucas, who runs the Writers at Risk program, had known him for many years, and his wife, and worked closely with them. Lou Xiaobo, as I'm sure many of you know, was a Nobel laureate, literary critic, writer, and human rights activist. He contracted cancer and was diagnosed while serving an 11-year prison sentence for his peaceful activism. He died on July 13th while I was serving my fellowship at the age of 61, while still in Chinese custody after being refused travel overseas for medical treatment. And his spouse, Lu Jia, was still under house arrest for a long time afterwards. So the day after his death, Kat organized a vigil outside of the Chinese embassy. We had a moment of silence, and some of his speeches and poems were read out loud. And I'll never forget when a young Chinese student studying in the UK came to the vigil and asked if he could read out a New York Times article. He read the entire piece while facing the embassy, reading about the legacy of his role model and the cruelty of the circumstances surrounding his death. It was profoundly moving. I met many people who were brave in the face of restrictions against their freedom of speech, but they were still hopeful, still fighting, and still speaking. Some of the other fascinating work I did at Penn, which I was not expecting to work on as much, was the Writers in Translation program. One of the main goals of Penn is to work to remove inequalities where they exist, which prevent people's enjoyment and learning from literature. And this is the focus of the translation program. I worked on the Penn Translate grant mostly, which promotes international literature and gives grants to publishers to meet the costs of translating new works into English. Literature, the internet translated works, they all allow people to engage with important ideas. Writing can converse diverse experiences and educate people about lives that are different and far from their own. And censorship often prevents this kind of education, even if it's the indirect censorship that comes from lack of exposure to certain writing of parts of the world. Penn Translate's grants have been awarded to some of the largest publishers in the industry, like Penguin Random House, as well as very small independent presses that focus on literature from specific regions, like Africa and Southeast Asia, where very little work is represented in the English market. And this was one of the questions that we had to grapple with, was do you award grants to smaller presses that might not have the funds for translation, or bigger presses like Penguin Random House, so they can set an example for translation for diversity in the literary industry. Only about 3% of all books published in the United States are works in translation, and compared to other countries that is very small. And this includes all books, so poetry, literary fiction, it's closer to about 0.7%. And most publishers, like I said, don't put much money into translation unless it's for international bestsellers like Murakami or Ferrante. And this is not only a barrier for writers around the world who wish to reach a larger audience, but it's also a massive setback for English speakers who miss out on some of the most interesting and important voices in contemporary literature. I've also come to believe that translation can be used as a tool of activism and dissent. And here are several examples of how Penn uses translation as an act of resistance. These are a few books that have been translated into English with the funding and support from English Penn. One is the recently published book, The Accusation, Forbidden Stories from Inside North Korea. This is by a North Korean dissident writer that goes under the pseudonym Bandy. In 1989, he began secretly writing these and then smuggled them out of North Korea with the help of the Penn Translate grant. The sad part is one of the only books of Thai short stories to be ever published in English. And The Queue is a dystopian novel that follows the rise of a centralized authority. It's from an Egyptian author named Basma Abdelaziz, who for years worked with victims to study the psychological effects of torture. The collection and translation of these stories and works is meaningful work. To think about this in a human rights framework, I found myself asking questions about how we're to connect the distance between ourselves and the other without translated literature. It's always played a role in informing public opinion, and books have been able to provide a specific insight into the experience of discrimination and injustice. Night by Elie Wiesel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Second Sex, A Room of One's Own, Native Son, I could go on. Literature still does play a role, and I think the spike in sales of Orwell's 1984 show us that people still turn to literature to understand the things around them and to make sense of the world. And so to think about how translation functions as a human rights tool, I thought, how are we to understand the reality of life inside North Korea without stories smuggled out? And how are we to encourage empathy for marginalized group of people like immigrants without reading accounts of life in their own words? And at Penn, translation is celebrated as just this, a collaborative act that can connect and educate writers and readers around the world. Another thing I helped organize and work on was the Brave New Voices campaign. And this is a campaign that sends writers into schools to work with students that are asylum seekers, migrants, and it teaches them poetry and writing. And then at the end of the summer, we put on an event where they were able to read their poetry in front of everyone. and it was incredibly rewarding. They were all very proud to be published in the anthology that came at the end of it. Some of the children were as young as 12, and they read these beautiful crafted poems about their life. One day, one student afterwards said it was the best day of his life. So I applied to this internship to understand what happens when language meets human rights. And I've seen several examples of how powerful this can be. The language of protest, the language of translation, the language of literature. I sat around a table and listened to Muharrem tell us, we're all able to sit here today and have this conversation because of people like us who thought like us in the past. Stood across from the Chinese embassy and listened to that young man read the New York Times piece as loud as he could. He pointed to the closed windows of the embassy and raised his voice above the passing traffic, saying, Liu Xiaobo died with dignity and honor. Face the Chinese people. I listened to Beyjan Matur, a Turkish poet, talk about what it means to write in the language of home. Previously in prison for her poetry, she talked about humming poems when she had no way to write them down in her cell, learning to employ her hearing in the dark and desolate room so she could think about the poems rhythmically. One of her poems reads, Our voices are our only shelter in the lit night. Who can we turn to? What words can we use to speak of pain? In what language can we ask to be forgiven? I've listened to the poetic voices of young refugees and migrants, the poems and prose in dozens of languages, and heard activists raise their voices together to demand justice. I read the words of people of Liu Xiaobo, Ahmed Shuk, Nabil Rajab, Raif Badawi, bloggers, writers, translators who work means so much to the world. And after my time at English Penn, I'm more convinced than ever that literature has the ability to foster empathy, connection, and hope within a human rights framework. I've also learned that it can be a powerful tool in its ability to raise dissident and disenfranchised voices. I can't thank English Penn and Gallatin enough for this opportunity, and learning from you all and getting to know you has been incredible. And I will take many lessons about writing and work and courage. So thank you.